He told his father he was going for a walk. That was May 8th, 2008, an ordinary sentence in a small Colorado town. 2 blocks away, an abandoned cabin sat empty for years, slowly rotting and, it would turn out, holding a secret. 7 years later, in 2015, workers tearing down that cabin pulled away brick and mortar and found skeletal remains lodged inside a chimney. The remains were identified as Josh Maddux, an 18-year-old from Woodland Park. I'm Elena Ward. This is Still Unanswered. Today, we go back over what we know, what we don't, and the questions that keep this case unsettled. Before we get into forensics and theories, I want us to hold something steady. Josh was a person, a son, a brother, a friend. He liked to play guitar, he wrote, he walked. His family remembers a curious, artistic kid who seemed on the surface to have weathered some hard things with an open smile. We're going to talk about difficult possibilities today, but we'll try to keep the story grounded in respect and facts. Marcus, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Elena. It's important work, to look carefully, not sensationally. I'm ready to walk through the medical and physical pieces and explain what they can and can't tell us.
Okay, let's start with the setting. Woodland Park. Tell listeners who might not know it what that place feels like and why a teenager wandering off for a walk wasn't unusual.
Woodland Park sits at about 8,400 feet elevation west of Colorado Springs. It's forested, mountain air, lots of trails and old cabins, old mines. In a town like that, teens have space to roam. Exploring abandoned structures is, sadly, a fairly normal kind of curiosity. You mix isolation, cold nights at elevation, and older buildings that aren't properly secured, and you have conditions conducive to misadventures.
Right. And Josh, born around 1990, was 18 in 2008. Family remembers him as free-spirited and creative. We should also note that he had experienced family trauma. His older brother, Zachary, died by suicide a couple years earlier. The family said he was resilient, but of course, public-facing resilience doesn't mean there wasn't private pain. On May 8th, 2008, he left home and said he was going for a walk. He never returned. What I want listeners to keep in mind, and you, Marcus, is that the initial missing person investigation appears to have been routine. The family checked friends, hangouts, local shelters, and eventually it went cold. There were no confirmed sightings, no financial or digital traces. So for 7 years, the family lived with ambiguity. Then, in August 2015, when the owner of a near-neighboring cabin started demolition, they found the body.
That's the thing about delayed discoveries. After years, the physical evidence we rely on is compromised. By the time they pulled the chimney apart, decomposition was advanced. That changes what an autopsy can tell you. Skeletal remains can give you identification and some clues about trauma, fractures, cut marks on bone, but soft tissue injuries are usually lost. If someone was strangled with a ligature or suffocated without bone injury, those signs may not survive years of decay.
Let's walk listeners through the discovery as it's been reported. The cabin was only 2 blocks from the Maddux family home, owned by a man named Chuck Murphy. Sometimes reports say Chuck, sometimes give a different first name, so we'll stick with what is most consistently reported. The cabin had been largely vacant for years. During demolition, workers broke into the chimney and found skeletal remains inside. Dental records and a distinctive finger bone deformity matched Joshua. He was wearing only a long-sleeve thermal shirt when recovered. Other clothes were later described as being found in the cabin near the fireplace, though details around that have been disputed. Marcus, take us into that scene. How does a body end up inside a chimney? What does the position and clothing tell you, if anything?
There are a few possibilities to consider, and I want to be careful with language. The autopsy in this case was constrained by skeletonization, and the Teller County coroner ultimately listed the manner of death as undetermined. That means the coroner couldn't, with high confidence, say this was an accident, suicide, or homicide based on the available remains. As for how someone can end up in a chimney, chimneys, depending on construction, can be surprisingly large internal tubes. A determined person could enter from the roof, or a person could be placed down from the fireplace side, though that side often is blocked by hearths or furnishings.
The reports say the body was in a fetal-like curled position, with legs possibly above the head, as if he had gone in head first or ended up inverted. The fireplace itself, inside the cabin, had a large wooden breakfast bar, described as having been ripped from the kitchen wall and placed in front of the fireplace, effectively blocking it from the interior. The owner, Chuck, insisted that the top of the chimney had wire mesh or rebar in place to keep animals out, which he said would make entry from the top impossible. But by the time investigators saw the site, demolition had already started, and material may have been disturbed. Marcus, can you address some of these physical claims? The breakfast bar, the mesh, the fetal position, the clothing?
Sure. First, the fetal position and inversion. A person who becomes stuck can end up curled, particularly in a constrained shaft. If someone tries to descend head first and can't move, gravity and flexion of hips and knees can put the legs over the torso. It's grotesque and hard to imagine, but physically possible. Second, the breakfast bar blocking the fireplace. That matters. If the fireplace opening is blocked from the inside, then entry from inside the cabin into the chimney seems unlikely unless that block was placed after the person was already in the chimney. If the bar was moved later, by workers, by an intruder, by the owner, the sequencing matters a lot. Third, mesh on the chimney top. Such screens are common to keep animals out, but they can be damaged, removed, or bypassed. Rusted mesh can have gaps that allow a small person to squeeze or be forced through. Unfortunately, because demolition started before a controlled forensic survey, clarity about what existed when is reduced.
That's a key problem in this case: scene contamination. We have claims about what was or wasn't there, and we have the physical reality that the structure wasn't carefully preserved for evidence collection. That opens the door to multiple plausible narratives. Before we examine those narratives, can you explain what undetermined specifically signals? Listeners sometimes interpret that as they didn't try, but that's not right.
Correct. Undetermined is a formal manner of death classification when the medical examiner or coroner cannot say with reasonable medical certainty whether the death resulted from natural causes, accident, suicide, homicide, or undetermined cause. It's an acknowledgement of insufficient or ambiguous evidence. In skeletonized remains, undetermined is not uncommon because soft tissues that might show bruising, hemorrhage, ligature marks, or internal injuries are gone. The coroner in this case, Al Bourne of Teller County, reviewed the skeletal remains, found no signs of trauma on bones, and no evidence suggestive of foul play that could be identified via the bones. He also noted that toxicology is usually limited in these cases due to decomposition. Preserved hair or bone samples can be tested, but many substances simply don't persist in a way that's diagnostic years later.
The coroner did offer a working idea, though, that perhaps Josh entered the chimney and became stuck, then died by a combination of dehydration, hypothermia, or positional asphyxia. He also appeared to discount suicide, saying there are easier ways to do it than climbing into a chimney. Marcus, talk us through those possibilities: dehydration, hypothermia, positional asphyxia, especially in a chimney environment, and how they could lead to death over an extended period of time.
Okay, I'll unpack them one by one. Hypothermia occurs when the core body temperature drops to the point where normal physiological functions fail. In mountain towns at elevation, nights can get very cold. Paradoxical undressing is a phenomenon in late-stage hypothermia. Victims feel burning heat and remove clothing. That could explain partial undress, although you don't want to leap to that as the first or only explanation. Dehydration. If someone is stuck in a confined space without water, they can die over days from dehydration. But usually decomposition is already advanced after weeks or months, so timing is tricky. Positional asphyxia. If the person is in a body position that compresses the chest or obstructs the airway, for instance, body bent over such that the diaphragm can't move, respiratory failure can ensue. A chimney is an unusual place, cold, restricted, and if someone is upside down, perfusion to the brain can be affected quickly. But depending on the position, death from positional asphyxia might happen in hours to a day or two. Over 7 years of decay, we can't see the soft tissue markers that would confirm these mechanisms, but they're physiologically plausible.
So, the coroner's working theory is plausible medically, even if it can't be proven by bone alone. Now, let's get into the puzzling scene details that have driven both community speculation and some investigators back to the scene. The breakfast bar, the mesh at the chimney top, and the clothing being found inside the cabin near the fireplace. Each of these elements pushes the story in different directions. I'm going to lay out 3 broad theories, and then we'll take them apart. Theory 1. Tragic misadventure. Josh climbed in, or was trying to get into the cabin, got stuck, and died alone. Theory 2. Foul play. Someone else was involved, possibly an acquaintance named Andrew Richard Newman, who later allegedly boasted, "I put Josh in a hole." Theory 3. Negligence and scene contamination. Things were moved, memories are unreliable, and the demolition muddied the evidence so much that this looks suspicious, even if the reality was accidental. Marcus, let's start with Theory 1. How plausible is it that an 18-year-old, known to explore, might try to enter an abandoned cabin via the chimney and become fatally trapped?
It's plausible, not common, but plausible. People have died in unusual misadventures. Falls into wells, entrapments in cisterns, rural teenagers getting into confined spaces they can't get out of. Chimneys present a tapered space. Depending on internal dimensions, mortar, and brick, a person can wedge in tightly. If he climbed down headfirst, perhaps to avoid falling from the roof, and became lodged, the lack of oxygen could lead to asphyxia, or the position could impair respiration. Then hours to days of exposure and dehydration could follow. The absence of bone trauma fits with a non-violent trapping scenario. The biggest questions are, why would he attempt it, and, as we discussed, did the top of the chimney have mesh?
Right. And on the mesh question, Chuck Murphy said there was steel rebar or wire mesh over the top to keep animals out. He insisted that would have made entry from the roof impossible. But it's not documented whether that mesh was present in 2008, or whether it had gaps or was later removed. There are also claims Murphy noticed bad smells in the cabin earlier and assumed they were animals, which could be consistent with a hidden body for years. There's equally the breakfast bar. He claims it wasn't in front of the fireplace earlier and that someone had deliberately moved it. If both are true, mesh on top, bar blocking the inside, how could a lone accidental descent happen? Marcus?
If both those things were true and present at the time he went missing, a solo descent seems highly unlikely. That would push us toward either the bar being moved after the fact, the mesh being damaged at the time, or an external actor involved who manipulated the environment. But again, the demolition and time gap are confounders. Workers could have moved the bar when clearing debris, or animals and weather could have broken the mesh. Without contemporaneous documentation, photos or police records showing the precise condition before demolition, it's hard to be categorical.
Let's pivot to Theory 2 briefly. There's an individual whom online communities and some tipsters pointed to, Andrew Richard Newman. He's described in various accounts as someone who ran with a rough crowd and later had a violent criminal record, including a homicide in New Mexico. Some people say Newman bragged he had put Josh in a hole. There's no public evidence that ties him physically to the cabin scene in 2008. Marcus, from a forensic point of view, how much weight should we give statements like that when the physical evidence is limited?
Statements like that are important leads in an investigation, but they need to be corroborated. Hearsay or later reported boasting can be motivated by attention-seeking, memory distortion, or even misinterpretation. A confession or boast is far more powerful if it's accompanied by corroborative details only the perpetrator would know. In the absence of DNA, witness placement, phone records, or physical traces linking Newman or anyone else to the cabin at the relevant time, an allegation alone doesn't satisfy the standards for a criminal charge. That said, and I want to emphasize this, law enforcement absolutely should follow up credible leads about potential involvement, especially if the individual has a violent history. The limitation here is that after 7 years, you lose ephemeral evidence like fingerprints on soft mortar, and if nobody preserved the demolition area, traces can be lost.
Allegations can point investigators in a direction, but without corroboration, they're circumstantial. It's also worth noting the sociological dynamics. A person with a violent later conviction will attract suspicion retrospectively. That doesn't make them innocent, but it doesn't make them guilty either. What do we know about the clothing? Most striking to people is that his body was found wearing only a long-sleeve thermal shirt, and other clothes were found inside the cabin around the fireplace. Some early retellings said clothes were neatly folded, a detail that then took on a life of its own on forums, but later it's clarified that neatly folded may be rumor. Marcus, does partial undressing fit better with hypothermia/paradoxical undressing, or does it raise the possibility of an encounter where he was undressed by someone else?
Partial undressing can be explained by several mechanisms. Paradoxical undressing in hypothermia is well described in literature. Victims remove clothing because their sensation of skin burning overrides rational behavior. That can happen late in hypothermia. Alternatively, someone can be partially undressed prior to becoming incapacitated. Perhaps he was changing clothes, or was coerced or assaulted. There's also a mundane possibility. In a confined space, garments could have been removed to negotiate the fit. Taking off bulky pants could make it easier to try to squeeze through. Finally, as you pointed out, demolition and handling of the scene could have moved clothing. If clothes were recorded as folded, that's a very particular detail that would suggest intentional placement, but I haven't seen a reliable official source confirming neatly folded. The Washington Post and coroner reports confirm that other clothes were found near the fireplace, but they don't support the folded narrative unequivocally.
So, on clothing, nothing definitive. Let's pause. I want to read a short passage, and you'll interrupt me if you want to comment. A neighbor, or rather the owner, Chuck Murphy, later said he'd noticed bad smells and assumed animals. He also insisted the chimney was mesh-topped. He said the breakfast bar wasn't originally blocking the fireplace. Those statements have fueled suspicion, either that someone manipulated the scene or that memory is unreliable. Marcus, what are common memory traps in these ownership narratives? How suspicious should listeners be of those contradictions?
People misremember details all the time, especially over years. Owners of old properties may visit infrequently and can't reliably attest to every condition. Also, after a shocking discovery, memories can retroactively reshape. We recall things differently when we know an outcome. That said, owners can also have motives to emphasize certain narratives, for example, to deflect responsibility if a trespasser died on their property. I'm not saying Chuck is lying. I'm saying that memory plus potential motive equals a need for documented corroboration. Police often look for photographic evidence, maintenance receipts, or third-party testimony to confirm such claims.
Let's go back to the coroner's broader set of observations. No signs of trauma on the bones, no drugs identified by toxicology, though decomposition limits those results. Coroner Al Bourne said the most probable explanation was entrapment and death by exposure or positional asphyxia, and he specifically discounted suicide as an unlikely method. For listeners, let's briefly explain why suicide by chimney would be unusual.
Suicide is a purposeful act. Common methods statistically include firearms, poisoning, hanging, and suffocation, depending on region. To choose a chimney as a method requires both knowledge that the space will trap you and a tolerance for an agonizing, prolonged death, often with a degree of uncertainty about whether it will work. People who are suicidal tend to choose methods that are more certain. That doesn't make it impossible, but it's less consistent with typical suicide behavior.
Thank you. Now, I want to walk through the 3 theories in more detail and weigh evidence. We'll take the accidental misadventure first, then foul play involving an acquaintance like Newman, and finally the negligence/scene contamination hypothesis. Marcus, you already said misadventure is plausible. What would be the strongest pieces of evidence in favor of that scenario in this specific case?
In favor. 1. The coroner's findings, no bone trauma, are consistent with nonviolent death. 2. Josh's personality and local context. He liked to walk, explore, and he was young. Curiosity can lead to risky behavior. 3. The location. A derelict cabin 2 blocks from home is the kind of place a teenager might snoop around. 4. The physiological plausibility. A confined space at elevation, cold nights, and the potential for positional asphyxia and hypothermia. 5. The absence of forensic markers of a struggle, though that's tempered by decomposition.
And the weaknesses of that account?
Weaknesses. The reported breakfast bar blocking the fireplace. If it truly blocked the opening prior to demolition, that complicates the solo entry story. 2. Reports of mesh at the top of the chimney. If it was intact and included rebar, top entry would be difficult. 3. The partial clothing discrepancy. The thermal shirt on the body and clothes near the fireplace, that's an odd arrangement that invites alternative explanations. 4. The simple fact that it took 7 years to discover him so close to home raises questions about why someone didn't notice earlier, but that can be explained by an unused cabin and people assuming smells were animals.
Now, theory 2, foul play. We mentioned Andrew Richard Newman, who has a violent background and is alleged to have braggadocio about putting Josh in a hole. For the sake of careful reporting, I want to stress that law enforcement has not publicly charged him in connection with Josh's death. Marcus, what sort of evidence would investigators need to move from suspicion to something prosecutable in 2008 or even later?
They would need either physical evidence linking him to the scene at the relevant time, DNA, fingerprint, property receipts, photos placing him there, or strong corroborating testimony, witnesses who reliably place him with Josh around the disappearance date, or a detailed confession containing non-public information. Phone and travel records could place him in the area. Surveillance and cell phone tower data were less pervasive in 2008 than now, but anything could potentially help. Ultimately, a prosecutor needs probable cause supported by evidence that can survive cross-examination.
The online narrative imagines a few possible scenarios. A prank gone wrong, where Josh is dared to climb down, remove some clothes to fit, becomes stuck, and a companion panics and leaves, or a sexual encounter that turns violent, or outright murder, with the breakfast bar intentionally used to block the fireplace. Which of these, if any, align with the physical evidence?
All of those are hypothetically compatible with aspects of the physical evidence. The lack of bone trauma doesn't rule out a violent act that didn't involve fracturing bones. If a person was forced into a chimney and left, you might not see bone injury. However, an assault often involves defensive injuries on bones, wrist or forearm fractures from struggling, but not necessarily. The breakfast bar being placed intentionally is a significant action. Moving a heavy unit implies effort and intention. If that bar truly blocked the fireplace before demolition and was not the result of later movement, it would be tough to reconcile that with a solo misadventure without inside manipulation. But proving that sequence is the challenge.
Listeners, at this point, it's worth mentioning how mythology grows around cases like this. A single evocative image, the boy in the chimney, invites narrative filling. On Reddit and in online forums, details like neatly folded clothes or the mesh become solid facts through repetition. We have to be cautious. Marcus, how do investigators guard against rumor-driven leads? Or do they encourage tips, even if some will be unreliable?
Investigators want tips. Every tip could be the one that matters. But they also have to triage, separate plausible, corroboratable leads from hearsay. They use timelines, physical evidence, and corroboration to prioritize. Public investigations are messy because even a false lead can consume resources. Good investigators record leads meticulously, document their sources, and try to corroborate independent elements before acting.
Let's address Theory 3, negligence and scene contamination. This is less dramatic, perhaps, but possibly the most mundanely true explanation in many cold cases. The place simply wasn't secured, things were moved, and that muddied everything. Chuck Murphy says he checked on the cabin sometimes. Workers had been in and out. Demolition began before evidence was secured. How common is it for a site like this to be compromised before police are called?
It's disturbingly common. Property owners sometimes begin demolition for safety or redevelopment reasons and aren't fully aware they're dealing with a potential evidence site. If a site is privately owned and there's no ongoing criminal investigation in place, there's no legal requirement, absent probable cause, to preserve it indefinitely. From a forensic standpoint, once people start moving debris, chain of custody is broken and tiny but meaningful clues are lost. That doesn't mean foul play didn't happen, but it means we lose the ability to use certain lines of inquiry, and that uncertainty fuels speculation.
Listeners, as Alina speaking, I want to say that ambiguity is one of the crueler things for families to live with. The Maddux family had to spend 7 years without knowing. When they did finally learn where Josh was, that was relief and horror at the same time. Marcus, what would you have liked investigators to do differently, given the constraints?
Hindsight is always clearer. Ideally, when a long-term missing person is reported and there are any properties in proximity that might be of interest, those properties should be documented early. Photographs, statements from owners about recent access, and, if demolition is planned, a quick check or search should be requested. Once remains are found, even in rubble, a controlled scene should be established immediately to the extent possible. That doesn't always happen because resources are finite, but even limited early documentation can preserve critical context.
Let's take a step back and talk about decomposition and confined spaces. You mentioned earlier that chimneys can preserve remains in particular ways. How does being inside a chimney for years affect what we can find and interpret?
A chimney is a constrained, sometimes dry environment. It can slow certain aspects of decomposition under some conditions and accelerate others. It depends on airflow, animal activity, and whether the space is open to the elements. Bones can essentially remain in place for years, but soft tissues disappear. Animal scavenging might move bones, and rodents can chew at remains. With time, the interaction of moisture, freeze-thaw cycles at high elevation, and microfauna alters the scene. Crucially, soft tissue signs that could indicate asphyxia, strangulation, or certain blunt force injuries are lost. So while bones can show fractures or cut marks that survive, a lot of the forensic story is gone.
And that forensic limitation pushes us back to the social evidence. Witness statements, who saw Josh last, who had access to the cabin. On that front, one odd feature is that the cabin sat only 2 blocks from Josh's home. I want to ask, why might someone not search that property more thoroughly in the early days? It seems obvious in retrospect.
Several reasons. First, property owners and neighbors may not realize the significance. Abandoned structures are common and often considered off-limits. Second, people assume if someone was in their house, they'd be seen or they'd call. Third, police resources focus on the most immediate leads, friends, social circles, and known environments like parks and highways. Unless someone specifically suggests checking that cabin, it may simply not get prioritized. It's a tragic fallibility of many missing person investigations.
We talked about the paradoxical undressing possibility. For listeners who haven't heard that term, it describes someone in severe hypothermia who suddenly removes clothing because they feel burning heat even as they're freezing. It's counterintuitive, but documented. It's one hypothesis for why Josh might have been partially undressed. Another is he removed clothing to attempt to fit into the chimney. A more disturbing one is that someone removed garments as part of assault. We must be careful to label which are speculation. Marcus, given your medical perspective, are there any physical findings from the bones that would support or contradict sexual assault?
With full soft tissue, we could look for lacerations, bruising, or DNA evidence, all of which can be directly informative. From bones alone, you might see pelvic fractures or other trauma inconsistent with postmortem damage, but many forms of sexual assault leave no bony signature, so absence of skeletal trauma is not exculpatory. In short, bones tell us a lot about mechanical injury, not much about many kinds of sexual assault, especially after decomposition.
That leads to another important ethical point about discussing possible sexual violence in cases with limited evidence. We need to acknowledge possibilities without asserting them as facts. The family's perspective matters. They reportedly were relieved to finally know where Josh was, but remained skeptical about the purely accidental explanation. Publicly, they wanted answers. Marcus, in your experience with cold cases, what typically leads families to feel there's more going on than the official ruling?
Often, it's the lack of a satisfying narrative. Undetermined is a frustrating label because it doesn't tell you who to hold accountable or what happened. Families look for intentionality. Did someone do something to my loved one? Partly because purposeful explanations are more actionable. You can seek justice, you can confront someone. When a case is called an accident, but the mechanics are strange or inconsistent, families may sense that critical pieces are missing, or that there was investigative misstep. Also, if there are locally circulating rumors about suspects, families may latch onto them because they provide a focus for grief and anger.
That's a humane answer. Before we move to closing, I want to confront the internet's role here. The Boy in the Chimney has become a story people retell late at night. Reddit threads are full of speculation, and each retelling often adds certainty to uncertain details. What subtle damage can that do to an investigation and to a family's grief?
It can be double-edged. On one hand, public attention can produce new witnesses, new tips, and pressure for re-examination. On the other hand, it can create noise, false leads, misremembered or invented details that muddy serious inquiries. It can also inflict harm on families who read lurid theories about their loved one. For investigations, the challenge is to parse signal from noise, and for families to guard their own emotional well-being in a very public discourse.
We tried, throughout this episode, to clearly label what's documented and what's speculative. To summarize what is well established, Joshua Maddux, 18, missing May 2008 after he told his father he was going for a walk. No confirmed sightings afterward. In August 2015, during demolition of a nearby long vacant cabin 2 blocks from the family home, skeletal remains were found in the chimney and identified as Josh by dental records and a distinctive finger bone deformity. The coroner found no trauma on the bones and ruled the manner of death undetermined, though he suggested an accidental entrapment scenario was plausible. Beyond that, the sequence of events within the cabin, who moved what and when, whether the chimney had mesh in 2008, whether anyone else was present, remains unresolved and disputed. Marcus, is there anything in that summary you'd change or underline?
That's a careful, accurate summary. I would only underline the central forensic limitation. Years of decomposition remove many answers. That doesn't close every door. It just makes some lines of inquiry much harder to pursue. If new, credible information surfaces, phone records, witness statements, photographs from 2008, those could reopen stronger pathways.
So the case sits at an uneasy intersection of plausibility and uncertainty. The accidental misadventure narrative fits with some of the medical findings and Josh's personality. A foul play narrative fits with contradictions about the fireplace and the mesh and the alleged "I put Josh in a hole" statement. And the contamination neglect narrative explains how the scene's ambiguity could have grown. None of them are airtight. Marcus, if you were advising the family or investigators today with no new information to hand, what would you recommend they ask for or pursue?
I would recommend a few practical steps. 1. Re-interview people who were around in 2008. Sometimes memories refresh or new details emerge when asked with careful, non-leading questions. 2. Search for any photographs, maintenance records, or receipts that might show the cabin's condition between 2008 and 2015. 3. Re-examine any physical evidence preserved from the scene for DNA or trace materials with modern techniques. Sometimes older samples can yield new profiles. 4. Follow up on the identity of anyone who had reason to be in or around the cabin in 2008, including renters, known local teens, and those with a history like the one attributed to Newman. And check phone and travel records where possible. That won't guarantee a prosecutable case, but it's how you responsibly try to reduce uncertainty.
And what about the community? Sometimes local people privately hold keys to timing or small details. How should law enforcement balance sensitivity to rumor mongering while encouraging those people to come forward?
Proactively and gently. Offer anonymous tip lines. Emphasize that even small, embarrassing, or seemingly unrelated memories can be valuable. And protect confidentiality when possible. Publicize what types of details would be useful rather than just broad calls for information. For example, who saw someone at the cabin between May and August 2008? That can encourage focused, useful tips.
We're nearing the end of this hour. I want to ask you, Marcus, something less technical. Listening to this case, people often feel both horror and a dull, nagging sadness. How close he was to home, and how long the family waited. For the families of missing people who find remains in a nearby place, there's sometimes closure and sometimes new grief. From your experience, what does a settled outcome look like? Not legally, but emotionally.
A settled outcome, emotionally, usually comes from answers, even painful ones. If you learn the cause and the circumstances, you can integrate that reality into grieving. Ambiguity perpetuates the what-ifs and keeps people stuck. Sometimes, closure arrives through community acknowledgement, memorials, or properly convened truth, not necessarily legal resolution. That doesn't erase pain, but it can allow families to mourn with a firmer sense of what happened.
Josh's family publicly said they were relieved to know where he was, but they also continued to want answers. I think that's a human reaction. Relief that the unknown is now known, and anger or restlessness at the ways in which the story remains incomplete. Marcus, any last technical note you want to leave listeners with about what undetermined should mean to someone hearing it on a coroner's certificate?
Yes, undetermined is not a pronouncement of negligence or of a cover-up. It's a professional statement of uncertainty. It tells you that, given available physical evidence, the medical examiner cannot assign a probable manner. It should invite further inquiry if credible new evidence emerges, but it should also be respected as an honest appraisal of limits of scientific certainty in that instance.
Thank you. Before we close, I want to read a few small quotes about Josh. Not speculation, just who he was. Family and friends described him as a funny, creative kid who loved music and walking. One friend said he'd play guitar and make everybody laugh. It's easy in missing person cases for the story to get consumed by mystery and theory. I want to make sure the human detail remains central. Josh was someone's son. He was someone's brother.
And he still is, in memory.
If you have information that might help, please contact the Teller County Sheriff's Office or the local tip line. If you're a listener in the Woodland Park area and you remember small details, someone at a party in 2008 who had keys to the cabin, who was friends with Josh, even that can matter. We will link to public reporting we relied on, the Washington Post coverage in 2015, and archived community threads in the episode notes, so you can read for yourself and separate published fact from rumor. One last question, Marcus, the human one. After spending time on this case, what stayed with you?
The proximity. An 18-year-old who left home for a walk and was found a few blocks away years later. It's a reminder that tragedy can hide in very close places. It also stayed with me that the limits of forensic science are also human limits. We have thresholds beyond which time obscures answers. Keeping that in mind can temper both our desire for simple explanations and our appetite for casting blame without evidence.
Thank you, Marcus. To our listeners, this episode is about the Joshua Maddux case, the facts we have, the plausible medical explanations, and the questions that remain. It's an eerie, heartbreaking story because of how close it is to home and how many small contradictions refuse neat resolution. As always, we aim to hold victims and families with care, not to spin lurid narratives. If you have a tip, contact Teller County. If you're grieving and this episode stirred something painful, please reach out for support. Local resources are in the show notes. I'm Elena Ward. Marcus Ellison, thank you for joining me and for being careful with the science.
Thank you, Elena, and thanks to listeners for staying thoughtful through a difficult subject.
This has been Still Unanswered. For Josh and for all the families who wait, we keep asking the questions, and we keep listening. Good night.